this is a beer, before we even taste it, we can talk a little. Hops came into Europe starting about 1000 AD. Earlier than that, they either didn't have hops or they didn't use them for beer, and so they would find other things to make the beer bitter. They would use wormwood, they would use juniper, they would use heather, different kinds of plants that they had that were part of their culinary traditions, and they used.
You see, the smell is completely different.
Mm-hmm. It's very, very fruity.
Yeah.
Those heather flowers are very, very fruity.
Also have the notes
from the peated malt in there. So very complex nose, yeah. So you get a little bit of that Scottish whiskey. If you're familiar with a liqueur called Drambuie, that's made from Scotch whiskey and heather honey and heather. Oh, wow. And then so Drambuie, so this is sort of a Drambuie beer, really, in a way.
And also from the oak chips. Very acid?
It has some acidity to it. In the old days, again, they would age a beer for a year in oak or more, and sometimes the microorganisms that were living in the oak would actually create some acidity. Makes your mouth water, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's really mouth-watering thing. This, I think, would be excellent with some cheese as well, because it's strong, it's got some alcohol, a little carbonation, and then that bright sharpness, which would really help.
A little bit sour?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A little bit sour, but very, very complex, kind of a little like wine in certain ways. Well done.
Thank you, Mr. Mosher. And now we're going to have the pleasure to taste two very exquisite beers, very rare beers that Mr. Mosher generously brought to us. Tell us about those beers and what made them so special.
Sure. Well, the first beer we're going to taste is a beer called an Imperial Saison from a brewery called New Glarus Brewing Company. Mm-hmm. They're in southern Wisconsin, way in a tiny little village, and they've really had a very successful small brewery there. But they were very interested in everything. They're a very curious mind. The man that runs the place, and with his wife, he's a Weihenstephan trained brewer, but he also likes Belgian beer. So he's got a left brain and a right brain both working on beer.
He's balanced. Yeah.
He's very balanced. So he's got a lot of wood fermentations and a lot of wild things. And this is a beer that they make that's just a one-time beer.
The Saison beers are not very common here. So tell us about...
They're fairly rare. It is associated with French-speaking areas of Belgium, area called Wallonia. And they're generally called farmhouse beers because they're fairly rustic, top-fermenting ales. Often aged in oak for short periods of time. One unique feature of Saison is that they generally ferment them at extraordinarily high temperatures, 95 degrees Fahrenheit, which is crazy. But it's a difficult yeast. It's a slow fermenter. It needs oxygen. It takes a lot of skill as a brewer to be able to use it.
How slow, you say? Usually a beer takes about a week to ferment, but how long would it take a beer like this?
4 to 6 weeks.
Imperial Saison. What makes a Saison Imperial?
Well, Imperial is a term that originated with big, strong stouts that were shipped to the imperial court of Russia in the 17th and 18th centuries. And then later on in the 19th century, it became a trade term to designate either the top of the line of a company's products, that would be like their best line of products would be Imperial. So you can see this beautiful...
Sometimes expensive.
And always more expensive, yes.
That's exactly. A beautiful head.
It's beautiful head.
And a beautiful color. It's orange, yeah.
Yeah, and it had a little hazy. That's
yeah, it looks like one of those Belgian beers, like those.
Yeah. And
smells so good.
Smell it. Yeah, that's that Saison yeast. So beautiful nose. I mean, that's the great thing about Belgian beer. Like the Hefeweizen that we tried, Belgian yeast is very distinctive, and each yeast produces a different kind of aroma. You can take any kind of beer wort. You can take your India Pale Ale or your honey, and if you ferment it with Belgian yeast, it'll be a Belgian tasting beer. It's that important.
I here feel a bit also of pepper.
Black pepper?
Yeah, black pepper, yeah.
That's classic for Saison, is to have that peppery, it's a chemical called a phenol that has that spiciness. Oh yeah, see, that's the look.
Look at this. Wow.
Even in the United States, this is a hard beer to find because it's just a limited edition. They make a small amount. They may never make it again, who knows, And that's part of the fun.
Well, let's send my regards to Garrett Smith, my friend from climbing on the Washington, my climbing mate. Who is also a big beer fan. Cheers, Garrett. We're all very curious about this beer, very anxious to try it. And before we open it, could you please tell a little bit about this beer?
Sure. This is a beer with a great story. This is a beer. This is the first beer in really, as far as I've ever heard of, that was aged inside of a whiskey barrel.
Well, I've heard about beer being aged on Scotch barrels sometimes, but never on a bourbon.
Well, you know, bourbon barrels are America's gift to the world, because the law in Kentucky, the law in the United States for bourbon requires that you can only use the barrels once. So they use white oak barrels, which are very pungent, but then they burn them till they're very charred inside. And then the whiskey goes in there. It has to stay in there for a minimum of 3 years before it's allowed out of the barrel. And so during 3 years of aging, with a large amount of alcohol, you have these chemical transformations that go on in that oak. And the chemical in the oak, that in wood, it's that hard, waxy material that glues the fibers together. That's called lignin. And over a period of time, that lignin changes to vanillin, which is one of the components of vanilla. Right? So when you buy, and the other thing is, because that alcohol is so strong, the barrels are relatively sterile. And you can buy an empty whiskey barrel in Kentucky for about $20. Right, so they're really cheap, because, and of course, almost all Scotch whiskey, almost all rum, almost all tequila that's aged is aged in bourbon barrels, because they produce a huge amount of them and they knock them down and ship them overseas, and so it's just this great thing to have bourbon barrels. So anyway, Goose Island, let's have a taste of this and we can keep talking about it.
Where's Goose Island from?
Goose Island is from my own hometown of Chicago. They're the Chicagoland's, really Illinois' oldest brewery. They began as a brew pub. Look at that, looks like motor oil, doesn't it? Yeah. It began as a brew pub, and this beer, in fact, began life as the 1,000th batch in the brew pub in 1992. And again, just a special thing. They did for several years, only brewed this beer one barrel, one batch a year. You could only have it at the brew pub, because that's the only place to get Goose Island beers. And since I think about 2004, you can smell it from here. This beer to me smells like chocolate ice cream. Again, my experience has been whenever you put vanilla with chocolate, you get ice cream. Because our brains think about vanilla in terms of cake or desserts or ice cream. Those are the contexts that we normally get vanilla.
There's definitely a lot of vanilla here.
There's a huge amount of vanilla. So vanilla, maybe a little bit of coconut sometimes you get. You can smell the alcohol in there. It's definitely...
Wow,
this is very good.
Alcohol.
About 10%, I believe, 11%.
Wow. I can feel the chocolate in my mouth.
I'm glad I brought
very
this one
good.
down. In fact, I'm glad this one didn't break on my luggage.
I'm glad that Marcelo insists on having the show number 2, and so you had the chance to try it. Well, gente, desculpa fazer vocês passarem por isso, né? Eu imagino que muitos de vocês devem estar com a boca cheia d'água, mas é para estarem mesmo, isso vale a pena. Acho que a riqueza do mundo cervejeiro está exatamente nisso. O Sr. Mosher falou, mas interessantíssimo, que a função dos cervejeiros, das pessoas que estão trabalhando com isso, que trabalham com seres humanos, em estar provocando, em estar criando novas experiências, de alguma forma, está fazendo que as pessoas despertem alguns sentidos que não estavam sendo estimulados para a cerveja que ela está sendo produzida. Eu acho que essa é a grande mensagem de hoje, né? Eu queria agradecer aí a presença do Sr. Randy Mosher aqui no nosso programa, agradecer por ter trazido cervejas tão especiais para a gente, e a vocês por estarem assistindo e dividindo conosco esse momento tão especial.